Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover some interesting comments made by Armin Grigorian, who's the head of the National Security Council at the Opry conference last week. And then we're going to delve deeper into some of those comments, which were about the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh, and about the responsibility of specific parties. And then we're going to close with comments about the real choices facing Armenia today. During last week's Opry conference, Armin Grigorian, the National Security Council head in Armenia, made some controversial remarks. Let me just give you a background on what Opry is. Opry is the premier think tank in Armenia, and every year they have a conference for 3 days that brings in people from around the world to discuss important national and specifically international issues. And he was the opening speaker, actually, at this event. Mr. Grigorian stated the following about Russia. This is in regards to the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh.
Սա էլ տեղի ունեցել չէ, երբ որ մենք ամբողջովին կախված ենք Ռուսաստանից։ Ռուսաստանը եկել մեր ձեռից վերցրել է Լեռնային Ղարաբաղ կամ հայերից վերցրել է Լեռնային Ղարաբաղը եւ վերադարձրել է Ադրբեջանին եւ հետ են գնացել։ Սա եղել իրականությունը։ Ռուսաստանը վերցրել է։ Ես տպնդում առանց Ռուսաստանի թույլտվության այս պատերազմը դեռ չի։
Let's analyzing this from a very crude realpolitik point of view. Obviously, Mr. Grigorian is 100% correct, but what he does not mention is as important as what he actually says, which for his purposes is first and foremost the responsibility of the Prime Minister and the government in this, and along with the West in the catastrophe that we had in Artsakh last year. Now, moving on to what I refer to as the different parties that are responsible. We'll start with this current government, the Pashinyan government. And obviously we start from the period before the war, where the Prime Minister made some very provocative, uncompromising statements, as going as far as having a rally in Stepanakert, I think it was in 2019, where he said, unity, and that's the end of it, and there's nothing to discuss. More importantly, the Prime Minister was running the country for 2 years, not really understanding the relative weaknesses of our military compared to the enemy and the actual shape that the army was in. Moving on in the post-war period, obviously in Prague in late 22, after he recognized Artsakh as part of Azeri territory without putting any conditionality, without conditioning it with guaranteed rights or a negotiating process that would guarantee the personal security and safety of people of Artsakh, was really one of the triggering points that led to the events of the following year. In all fairness, that Prague declaration needs to be put in the context of where this country was at the time, which is post the Yermouk invasion, where essentially we found out that there are no security guarantees, that whatever we thought about a security blanket from Russia does not exist. And earlier that year, we had actually accepted a proposal from Moscow to freeze the status talks about Karabakh for the following 20 years, which was obviously rejected by the other side. What is unforgivable from the point of view of this current government is their essentially complete abdication of responsibility, politically, morally, over the people of Artsakh, and essentially the post-22 period and during the time of the blockade. It is a decision that will actually define our politics for the coming generation. Moving on to the US and the EU, let's be clear about one thing. Outside of France, both of these centers of power, the US and the EU, were actually completely fine with ethnic cleansing in Artsakh. What they actually wanted prior to the ethnic cleansing of September, October, is some sort of a fig leaf of an agreement that they themselves knew would lead to ethnic cleansing, but they wanted it done in a formal, legal manner. In so many words, they supported nice ethnic cleansing and not the version that happened. How do we know this? We know that during last year, when there were these constant UN Security Council meetings, it was the United States behind the scenes that was killing any efforts to put up any resolution, because for them the key thing was to push Russia out of the region, and if that meant the ethnic cleansing in Artsakh, that was a price for them that was well worth paying. To be on the record, I support our pivot to the West, but let's not have any illusions about our new blonde gods. Foreign saviors do not exist. Let's move on to Russian state responsibility. In real terms, outside of the regime in Baku, there's no party that was more responsible for the ethnic cleansing of last year than the Russian state, because frankly they had the capacity to draw the lines and they had the capacity politically and militarily to stop it. The reality is, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine essentially floundered after the first 3 weeks, it was inevitable that Baku and Ankara were going to press Moscow in Artsakh, and we saw that initially in April of 22 with the gas cut off to Artsakh. So they were already testing the limits, much as I believe the Russians actually wanted to stay in Karabakh for all eternity, to have their bases there. The realities of the short-term help that both Azerbaijan and Turkey give to the military campaign that the Russians are waging in Ukraine, whether it's laundering goods, laundering microchips, and most importantly, laundering their gas and oil to the world. That was a price that was more valuable in the short run than what happened in Artsakh in the long run, which would have been their preference to stay there for a long time. This obviously crescendoed into the really strange, cloudy events of last September, which obviously was very clear that Baku and Moscow were trying to trigger a war, a greater war with Armenia that Armenia could not win, and they were using the election of the new president as debate. This is something that Armenia did not respond to, which is the reason that we didn't have a major war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. We simply had the ethnic cleansing that the Russians allowed. Then the Russians moved on with the hope that the ethnic cleansing will actually lead to regime change in Armenia, and it actually had the exact opposite, because even people from Artsakh blamed them as much as they blamed the Pashinyan government. All of this, as far as these actions of these different powers and countries, should get us to, the ultimate question. And why is it that it was in the interest of every world power, pretty much, to either allow ethnic cleansing in Artsakh and the Second Armenian Genocide, or do nothing to stop it? The answer to that question is actually a simple one. If you're poor and you're weak and have no chips on the international poker table, you cannot expect anything else. International laws, and this has to do with human rights laws also, operate on a sliding scale of three factors: how rich you are, how strong you are, and how European you look. We failed, obviously, on the first two, and we get a low score on the last one. In short, if you're weak and you're poor, you have no rights that anyone is obligated to respect. Understanding that, the only goal that we can have, which is the primary political issue worth discussing, is whatever makes this country strong and rich. Everything else is secondary. Now we're going to move to our choices as far as directionally where this country is going and should be headed towards. There's a lot of discussion about the East-West choice in Armenia. If it's going, the Russian direction or the EU-US direction. But in some ways, that's really not the choice. The choice actually is not between East and West, it's between being poor and weak or rich and strong. And in the context of the world today, that can only mean one thing, which is a strong pivot towards the West, and more importantly, integration into Western systems. In crude terms, there is no future with Russia unless your ambition is to become Belarus with cognac and apricots. When discussing the state of Russian-Armenian relations today, there's a lot of discussions, most of it unintelligent. But I think all of the discussions should be started with the following framework. The Russian state today is not the enemy of this government in power, who I could personally care less about. The Russian state is the enemy of Armenian statehood and of Armenian independence. Russia wants an Armenia that is poor, dysfunctional, divided, and irrelevant. In crude terms, Russia and her proxies, whether it's Belarus or Azerbaijan, have no future themselves, and they know that. They simply don't want us to have one either. For 25 years, we traded democracy, prosperity at the altar of security, and at the end, we got none of the three. If you want a real-life example of that, which we pay for every day, is the mining concerns in Kajaran, which was essentially a giveaway to Russian oligarchs and some local political players. That mine, essentially on a yearly basis, clears somewhere between $800 million to $1 billion a year. That is a giveaway to people in Russia that absolutely did nothing to deserve it. If you amortize that over the 10 to 20 years, and the monies, if they were actually coming to us as they should, half of that money spent on national defense means there's no ethnic cleansing and there's no defeat in 2020. So this complete giveaway of our national sovereignty on so many levels cost us in real terms over the last 3 years. Having said all of this, regardless of all of these facts, I want to be clear about one thing. We need to strive to have as functional a relationship with Russia as possible given today's context, and at no point should we be part of pointless, needless provocations against them. In short, in so many words, no need to provoke the bear or poke him unnecessarily. International politics is a moving train. Today's adversary is tomorrow's friend, and which is frankly very likely to be the case 10, 20 years from now. I also do not want to imply that there's no real honest intellectual discussions to be had about the direction of this country. Every person who argues against a pivot to the West is not a Russian operative. Having clarified all of that, I want to discuss a group of people, for a lack of a better phrase, which I will refer to as the battered wife syndrome Armenians. These are people who will excuse any action by Russia and blame our side for the faltering relations between the two countries. They will find any excuse for a Russia which, let me give you a list, greenlit the invasion of Artsakh in 20 and Armenia in 22, is constantly using her proxy in Baku to attack us, refused to send us weapons that we paid for and is delaying delivering them all the time, is actually pressuring other countries to delay delivery of weapons in the case of Iran that we know, obviously failed to live up to her CSTO obligations after the invasion of Armenia in 22. Worst of all, allowing the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh. And in one of the most egregious case, last September, literally arrested and very likely sold Artsakh leaders to the Baku regime. The battered wife syndrome Armenians will tell you if we were more slavish, less independent, less democratic, and turned over more of our national assets to degenerate Russian oligarchs, we will be somehow magically back in the pre-2020 period. In essence, what they're demanding is a second kick of the mule, having learned nothing from the first kick of the mule. If you're going to categorize these battered wife Armenians, they come in different categories. The first one, the most obvious, are the individual operatives who actually work for the Russian state, some in the media, some in political actors here. And you can blame them all you want, but these are essentially people on payrolls doing their job. Secondly, it's actually political forces or political parties that essentially push the Russian state line both inside of Armenia and outside of Armenia. The third, and probably the largest group, are people that have historical memories of Russian-Armenian relations being much better than they are now. There's, more often than not, it's usually rather sentimental historical nonsense, but they have not received the memo about the political realities of today. For me, the most contemptible group, which are what I call the battered wife diasporans, these are the kinds of people who live in Los Angeles, Montreal, and Paris, who are always telling us to look at the map, not have dreams of living in a normal democratic country, and lecture us about the strong points of Putin, Lukashenko, and Xi Jinping's of the world. My question to these people is, why aren't you leaving your comfortable democratic rules-based lives in Los Angeles, Montreal, and Paris and moving to Moscow, Minsk, or Beijing? We all know the answer to that question. In conclusion, I sort of come to understand where these, what I call the syndrome people, come from. There are actually many people who really don't believe that we as a people or this country is actually capable of self-governance, and they have no confidence in our capacity to ever get to that point. I frankly don't have a problem if people believe that, given the mess that we've made of things for the last 30 years. There's actually a compelling case to be made for that. However, if you believe that, you need to say that honestly and forthrightly. But please do not insult our intelligence by making excuses for the degenerates sitting in the Kremlin today. Thank you for joining me in this episode of Insights.
I can buy myself flowers, write my